Good evening and welcome to Boston Virtual ARTCC's Instrument Approach Procedures Ground School. Today's the first of our two-part series looking at everything there is to know for the virtual sim pilot on instrument approach procedures. Much more than just flying ILS approaches, we'll be talking tonight about flying down to minimums, looking at missed approach procedures, different types of approaches, and a whole lot more of number of really interesting topics that are highly applicable to the virtual flight environment. So without further ado, let me hand the mic over to Alec to talk through a really interesting set of notes tonight on the first of our two-part series on instrument approach procedures.
Thanks for the intro, Evan. Hey everybody, very good to see you guys again. Tonight's objectives, we're going to discuss instrument approach procedures. We're going to help you guys understand the components of an instrument approach procedure or an IAP and how to fly them. And this is a really large topic, so we actually have it split into two sessions. Tonight we're going to introduce you guys to the IAP and just give you basic terminology, what they are, how to fly them. And then next week we're going to actually talk about how to fly them with air traffic control. So what's the point of an instrument approach? It takes an aircraft from the terminal environment to the airport. So from descending into an airport and being around an airport to the actual runway. This can begin from a star, which is a standard terminal arrival route. We'll talk about those in another session, an en route fix, or most commonly, it'll start with vectors to final approach form air traffic control. Instrument approaches can include anything, they can be driven from ground-based aids like a VOR, an NDB, or an ILS, as well as GPS-based approaches that use onboard aircraft equipment. Instrument approaches can be just to the airport in general, or they can be to a specific runway with circling to other runways authorized. Generally speaking, you have a couple of different activities to fly an instrument approach. First, you have to prepare the airplane and brief the approach with the rest of the flight crew to include relevant minimums, which is the lowest you can fly without seeing the runway, and the missed approach procedure in case you'd hit the minimums and don't actually see the runway at them. Then you proceed to the final segment of the approach. For a full approach, it's from the initial approach fix or the intermediate fix, or you can get vectors to final. Next, you descend to the MDA or the DA, which is the minimum descent altitude or the decision altitude, and we will talk about what that means in a few slides. And then you land or circle if visual references are in sight, or if they are not, you conduct a missed approach. And at any point, feel free to post questions in the chat. There are several types of approaches, 3 to be precise. First, a precision approach. Then you have an approach with vertical guidance, APV, and then you have a non-precision approach, which is an NPA. The approach type is often determined based on what kind of a nav aid you use, which is either ground-based or aircraft-based. Simply put, it's a non-precision approach if you use a nav aid on the aircraft, for example, a GPS, so you're using aircraft GPS receiver and satellites. And if you're using ground-based navigation like an ILS or really there's just ILS, and then there are a couple other small examples like a PAR approach, it's a precision approach. And you can also have multiple types of an approach combined on the same chart, depending on what aircraft equipment you have on board. And I know that's all very vague, and we'll dig into the nitty-gritty of this all over the next couple slides, so don't be concerned if you're not understanding it as of yet. Let's talk about the precision approach. This provides both lateral and vertical guidance. The lowest altitude on this approach is either a DA, a decision altitude, or DH, decision height. A DA is an altitude above sea level, so you read it on an altimeter, at which you decide whether or not you land. So you fly the approach, you hit that altitude on your altimeter, you see it, and you decide, do I see the runway? If yes, I land. If no, missed approach. A DH is more or less the same as a DA, but instead of height on an altimeter, it is height above the ground with radar altimeter. So instead of an altimeter sensing air pressure, you have a radar altimeter sensing your distance between the airplane and the ground below you, and that's when you use a DH. So on a precision approach, you descend to either the DA or DH, and then you decide if you land or initiate a missed approach. Example of this are an ILS, which is an instrument landing system, a PIR approach, or a GLS approach.
So the real key difference between a precision approach and then a non-precision approach, which we're going to talk about in the next slide, is this concept of a decision. So where we're looking at an ILS approach, which of course includes a vertical guidance component that's based on an actual ground-based nav aid, as Alex says, so a glide slope. When we're looking at that, the altitude that you descend to is a decision altitude. You're going to go down as far as the minimums allow. When you get there, that's the point you have to decide. Do I see the runway? Do I not see the runway? And if you do see the runway, of course, you continue to land. And if you don't see the runway or one of the other references associated with it, now you're conducting the missed approach. So the idea is that that decision is a point in time, as opposed to what we're going to talk about in a moment on non-precision approaches, where you don't necessarily get to an altitude and make a decision right at that point. Instead, you might be holding at that altitude for a certain period of time. You might be flying that altitude till you reach a actual distance point, and that in fact could be your missed approach. We'll talk about that in the next slide. But really that's the key between missed approach, or between a precision approach and a non-precision approach, is this concept of a decision altitude.
Yeah, exactly. So for a non-precision approach, conversely, you don't have any instrument vertical guidance provided. The lowest altitude you can descend to, your part of your minimums, is your MDA, which is the minimum descent altitude. You descend to MDA and remain there until reaching the missed approach point. If runway environment is in sight at the missed approach point, or MAP, you can complete the landing. If not, you initiate a missed approach. So examples are a VOR approach, an NDB, a localizer, or an RNAV with LNAV only capabilities. And let's just recap right here. For a non-precision approach, you descend down to an altitude and you maintain it until your missed approach point, and that's when you decide. On a precision approach, you descend on the glide slope until you hit your missed approach point, which is an altitude, and at that point you decide. So Mark asks in the chat, if you're on glide slope but don't see an altitude, must you do a go around or have faith that you'll see runway at some point?
See the airport. So I think the good question here is, the question is, if you're on the glide slope and you are not seeing the airport because of fog, are you required to go around? So the answer is yes, once you reach the decision altitude. So let's say that the minimums on the ILS, which we're going to talk about in a minute, have a decision altitude of 200 feet. What you would do when you're flying into Boston is you would fly on the ILS glide slope until you reach 200 feet on your altimeter. At that moment, you basically look outside. If you see a required reference, then you can continue on the glide slope toward the runway. If you do not see a required reference, you still see fog at 200 feet, you're commencing the missed approach at that point.
Cool.
And just, I guess, since we're here, let's talk about the comparison. So if instead you're flying a localizer approach, not an ILS, now you're flying a non-precision approach. The minimum, let's just pretend that the minimum was the same altitude, 200 feet, even though we wouldn't have that very often. Instead of doing that, descend to 200 feet, look outside, and if nothing is there, fly the missed approach. On a localizer approach, you would descend to that 200 feet, and at that minimum, you could actually stay at 200 feet and keep on flying toward the airport. And only when you reach the missed approach point, which will be defined by the chart, would you execute the missed approach. In practice, there's some nuance here because quite often we'll fly a localizer approach similarly to how we fly a precision approach. We'll actually calculate a consistent descent so that you would hit your 200 feet fairly close to the missed approach point. So there's some nuance for sure to that concept. But in the most basic form, the difference is really highlighted between the precision and the non-precision approach here. On the ILS, you go to 200, you don't see anything, you're on the missed approach. And on a localizer or a non-precision approach, you'd fly down to 200 feet, but you can stay there until you actually hit that missed approach point, at which point you're going to commence the actual missed approach procedure.
I think the main way to summarize this is, for a precision approach, the missed approach point is an altitude on the glide slope.
Yeah.
For a non-precision approach, the missed approach point is a geographic location, like a set of coordinates, and the way that you calculate or find those coordinates is on the chart.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. And next you have an approach with vertical guidance, APV. This provides lateral and vertical guidance, but not from a ground-based radio nav aid. So the lowest altitude can be a DA or an MDA, and examples of this are an RNAV with both LNAV, VNAV capabilities like you'd find on an airliner, or an LPV approach, which is which you'd find on small aircraft equipped with WAAS, or an LDA with glide path. So these ones you fly as if they are precision.
That's a new category that's kind of come up in the last 6 or so years, basically due to the fact that now we have RNAV, which we never had in the past. So before it was just precision and non-precision, and everything was based on some kind of a ground-based nav aid, a VOR, an ILS, and NDB. Nowadays, the ability to have RNAV approaches that simulate a glide path, but in many cases don't actually use anything ground-based, is made the requirement for this new type of category. And so when you're looking at an RNAV approach, the RNAV approach can be any number of things. It can be a non-precision approach if it's LNAV only, where you'd fly to an MDA, or it can simulate an ILS glide slope and become a precision approach almost, where you would, as Alex said, fly it like a precision approach down to a decision altitude and use that altitude as your decision point versus a physical point in distance, as we've talked about. And that's what makes the RNAV approach so interesting.
Yeah, exactly. So we have several different types of approaches. Air traffic control based, these are exceedingly rare. You'd very rarely see these. You have an ASR, which is an approach surveillance radar. That's a non-precision approach with an MDA. Then you have a PAR, which is a precision approach radar. That's precision. It's a DA. Both use ATC radar. It is exceedingly rare to use both of these. You would really only try to use these if you had a total failure somewhere in the clouds and you just could not navigate on your own by any means. Pilot-based, these are far more common and what you fly largely every day. So ILS, instrument landing system, precision approach with the DA, you have a localizer and a glide slope. LDA could be either. That's a localizer directional lead. It's like a localizer, only it's not exactly aligned with the runway heading. So on final, you have to make a short turn. Most commonly, it's non-precision with an MDA. It's rare for it to have a glide slope component to it. You can use the VOR approach. So if there's a VOR on the runway or on the field or somewhere off the field but aligned with the runway, you can use a VOR approach. That's non-precision with MDA. NDB, I would be hard-pressed to find any that are still in existence, at least in the US, probably in some mountainous or otherwise rural areas. But those are non-precision MDA approaches.
And they're terrible.
Yeah. GLS, I forget what the G stands for because I have never actually seen one in real life in my years of flying. That's a precision approach. It uses a GPS. And then you have an RNAV approach, which are becoming more and more common basically at every airport now. These could be either an MDA or a DA depending on what the approach is certified for and what the aircraft has on board, and that uses your GPS.
A GBAS landing system is what that one is, which is yet another acronym. And it was sort of I would almost, I don't know if this is a fair statement, but I'm going to say it anyway, sort of just became a failed approach type that they sort of looked at doing for a period of time and has basically been made obsolete with the idea of LPV instead. But they do exist. They're published at Newark. That's the only place I've ever seen a GLS approach. And I have never flown them, never heard them having been used, and I don't think there's anywhere in the United States that is actively using them or anywhere that is really promoting their use. I think to me it's something that's been made obsolete by the ability to have satellite-based augmentation. So basically using the existing satellites as opposed to actually adding another ground station at an airport to be able to replicate an ILS. I mean, if you have an ILS, you don't really need another ground station, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's not something you would ever see. Naming instrument approach procedures. Different types of approach names, and they all mean their own thing. You could have an approach to a runway, such as the localizer runway 21 approach. Then you could have an approach to an airport, not to a specific runway. That's denoted by a letter suffix. So in this case, VOR alpha approach into an airport. You could have an approach requiring multiple nav aids, such as the VOR DME alpha or the VOR DME runway 25 approach. So here you would need both a VOR and a DME to fly the approach into the airport or to the runway, respectively. Then you could have multiple approaches with the same guidance. In this case, a suffix letter starting from the back of the alphabet would indicate different minimum types. So you could have an RNAV RNP Zulu runway 21 left approach. And then you could have an ILS Yankee runway 28 approach to somewhere else. I'm assuming there would also be an ILS Zulu runway 28 approach with different minimums. you could have multiple approaches with different guidance on the same procedure, meaning you could have the ILS runway forward approach or a localizer runway forward approach using the same exact guidance from the ground. It just depends on what you are equipped to fly or what you choose to fly. And lastly, you could have overlaid approaches. For example, you could shoot either the VOR GME or GPS runway 1 high approach. Both are depicted on the same chart. Very confusing stuff. We'll talk about all these. Landing variations. Easiest one's a straight in. It's a direct instrument approach that doesn't need any procedure turn or any course reversal procedures for the alignment, such as holds, which we hinted about last week. For example, ILS runway 24. Straight in approach, you break out of the ILS, you land on runway 24, straight ahead, no funky stuff. Then you can have a circle to land maneuver, which is an alternative to the straight in landing. This can be either on a lettered approach, such as the NDB Bravo, or a circle to land minimum subset from another instrument procedure, such as the ILS 24 approach, but landing runway 6 with a circle. These are used when the runway is not aligned within 30 degrees of the F final approach course, or for an RNAV 15 degrees. Or the final approach requires 400 plus feet of descent per nautical mile. And these require some visual maneuvering of the aircraft within the vicinity of the airport after the instrument portion of the approach is completed. So if you are shooting a circling approach and you break out at minimums, you better be very sure that that throughout the entire circling maneuver, you won't lose sight of the airport. Because as soon as you break out at minimums and you begin the circle, that's no longer, that's a visual maneuver at that point.
One of the places that we see circling approaches come into play quite frequently is at Norwood, and that actually is featured in Wings IFR 23. The only approaches to Norwood are to runway 35. You have an RNAV and a localizer approach, but there's no instrument approach available to the other runways. So if you have a strong wind out of the south favoring runway 17, but you've got a ceiling at 500 feet, one of your only options may be to fly the RNAV or the localizer to runway 35, get down below the clouds, and then do a circle to land maneuver, effectively joining a downwind for runway 17 and visually maneuvering to land at the airport. It's a very interesting procedure. It's actually quite fun to fly. And of course, it also is certainly more risky than flying a regular straight-in procedure. And so there's a lot of rules for airline operators and for pilots who are flying for hire that differ from just those who are flying privately. A lot of airlines, especially of course in a bigger aircraft, are not going to entertain circle to lands because of the fact that there's so much visual maneuvering at low altitudes in crummy weather. It can be a recipe for trouble pretty quickly, but it's a lot of fun to fly.
Yeah, good point. Circle maneuvers are pretty fun, but got to keep your eyes out. Let's use this opportunity to pause for a second. Does anybody have any questions on what we've covered so far? Seeing none, we will continue on. Minimums. How low can you go? The minimum to choose depends on the type of approach, in other words, the nav type and the availability or lack thereof of vertical guidance. The aircraft category, which is based on the aircraft's final approach speed for that approach as shown in the table, and the landing option, such as a straight in, a sidestep, or a circle. If the airport's reported weather is below the minimum, can you attempt the approach? Answer.
Actually, maybe before you give the answer, let's see what people think. So give you guys a chance to be a little bit interactive. Wasn't quite as interactive a session today as last time with holds, but for people who are thinking they know everything there is to know about IFR, use the chat here and tell us what you think. So you're flying into an airport, the reported weather is below the minimum on the chart. Can you attempt the approach legally, hope that you can get in if you see the runway, or are you required to hold until the weather improves? Got a couple people saying yes. Anybody want to be brave and say no or maybe? So NH got a couple of yeses and nos. NH was commenting in TeamSpeak. NH, if you can actually speak in Google Meet, that's where the audio is all coming through. You can unmute your mic in here, but for those who didn't hear, his comment was it's dependent upon the aircraft category, which is also what Robert mentioned in the chat as well. So Alec, what do you think?
So the answer is, generally speaking, yes, you can attempt the approach. You simply need to have the runway or the runway environment inside within the prescribed minima on the procedure, at least for private operators. And I want to touch on that. Robert is correct here. For Part 91 flight, meaning private flight, you're going flying or you're not flying for an airline or air carrier, you can have the airport advertising as 0 feet, 0 visibility, and you can still attempt the approach all day long. It gets different once you get to the airline level or an air carrier level where you do need certain the airport advertising certain minimums or certain weather above minimums before you can attempt the approach. But for the private operator world, you don't care what the airport is advertising. You can legally shoot the approach anyway. Whether or not that's a smart idea is a different story, but it's legal.
A fun
So
fact
the
here, most
thought,
of the ICAO world, I know there's a question coming, most of the ICAO world, including Europe, has this same situation. So if you're an airliner, you can more or less look at the minimums and then decide what's legal or not. Canada has this extremely weird mathematical formula that you need to do that effectively involves seeing what phase the moon is in and how close Saturn is in relation to Jupiter to be able to decide if you can attempt the approach. It's an absolutely ridiculous system and confuses many, many pilots around the country. So we're hoping that Canada
I
modifies.
can't tell if you're kidding or not.
I'm not kidding. This is like not quite Jupiter and Saturn, but it's about we made a checklist for it at our operation in the 135 land, and it was about 10 steps long to determine what the appropriate minimum was. And then in our equivalent of 121, we have another like checklist sort of flowchart thing, and it's again about 8 different steps to figure out which of the minimums there are. And you either take the published minimums and reduce them by 75% or 50%, depending on the scenario, and the 50% is only available depending on some other scenarios. It's like literally it's like a 5 to 10 minute discussion to figure out, can we actually attempt the approach right now?
No kidding.
So be
That's
happy you don't
crazy.
fly in Canada. Sorry, I cut somebody off there. Maybe it was Joel.
Yeah, that was Joel.
oh yeah, I just was wondering if the thought there is when you're going to attempt an approach, even though the minimums are, not reported, or the weather is reporting that the minimums are not going to work, is the thought there that the weather station is incorrect?
No, the thought there, no, the thought there is mostly for, I guess, safety. And this is kind of uncomfortable to say, but I guess the FAA deems the safety of paying passengers on an air carrier in a higher regard than myself and my friends in our own Skyhawk on a private operation. Suresh, if you just want to mute your microphone in Google Meet. But the
But I
FAA
guess
basically
what I'm
dictates.
asking is if the ceiling is reported at 0 and the visibility is 0, why would you attempt the approach even though you still can?
So that gets into the question of should you and not legally can you, because those are two different
I
things
see.
here.
I see. I see. Okay.
So should you do it? No, probably not. Could you legally do it? If you're a private operator, yes. If you're an airline, probably not.
It is true also that the weather stations can be inaccurate. One of the examples that I can think of offhand is that there's a training airport a friend of mine used to fly out of. The weather station was located basically right next to a pond, and at certain times of the day, the pond would produce this fog that would actually obscure the weather station, but the actual airport was like totally wide open. And so there were times when it was actually reporting a ceiling of 50 feet or something, even though that was nowhere close to what the conditions were. But as Alex says, you don't know that going in unless you've gotten a pilot report or unless you've be able to see outside, which at night it can be very difficult to see fog. In fact, you can fly an approach and see the runway at one point, get down to 100 feet, and all of a sudden everything goes white, and that's a really bad place for you to be. Now you're below your decision altitude, but you can't see anything. So it's absolutely a consideration as to whether you should attempt an approach. But as Alex says, legal and what is safe or sometimes different things. Totally agree that you can look at emergency situations, but now you're looking at the laws don't really matter to you anyway, right? So even in the airline world, as soon as you declare an emergency, effectively the concepts of what is legal become whatever you as the pilot in command think is a good decision. But there's other contexts where you are a private operator where you might attempt an approach below minimums and see what happens, especially if it's close.
Yeah, I believe the FAA says that in an emergency you can break any law in 14 CFR to the extent required to meet that emergency. I think that's the official wording. And whether or not you broke the law too much, well, that's determined post-event. But that's getting into semantics. All right, let's actually talk about how to read minimums. So for starters, we have the DA and the RVR, which is the decision altitude and the runway visual range. So in this case, 239 is 239 feet on the altimeter. Remember, this is not height. This is altitude on the altimeter, 239 feet, and 4,000 feet of RVR down the runway, meaning you need to see 4,000 feet down the runway, and you need to break out at or above 239 feet on the altimeter.
I'll just comment briefly on the RVR. That's a topic that we don't talk about all that much in the simulation, but it's something that we virtual controllers do have access to, and we will report to you when the time is right. RVR is not something that a pilot can necessarily see. RVR is measured by a piece of equipment, or sometimes 3 pieces of equipment on a runway, and it's designed to represent, if you were sitting on the runway, how far could you see in significant fog or other limiting visibility factors. So it is a very helpful piece of information to have as you're flying an approach, but it's not something that you can report. So every now and again, you have a pilot who comes in and they're like, I'd like to report the RVR is 6,000. You're like, that's not quite how it works, but thank you for trying. That being said, when the conditions are such that the visibility is reported at less than a mile, or if we have an RVR reading of less than 6,000, the controllers here in Flight Sim, at least at Boston, will give you that in your landing clearance. So you may have heard runway 4 right, clear to land, the touchdown RVR is 6,000, the midpoint is 4,000, the rollout is 2,000. So they're giving you that piece of information, and then depending on which category you're in, if you're operating as a private flight, that doesn't really matter to you. If you're operating as an airliner, that 2,000 rollout RVR could be a limiting factor depending on how your actual operation is run.
But for the private world, RVR is just more of a heads up and not a legal mandate.
Yep.
Except when it comes to minimums. Next, you have the MDA and RVR. So MDA here is 380 feet. And why do you guys think that is? Why do you think that the MDA here is a whole 141 feet higher than the DA?
Again, feel free to comment in the chat or unmute your microphone and share your thoughts.
Someone says obstacle, someone says MSL and AGL, and someone says no glide slope. No glide slope guidance, less precise. The last 3 guys hit the nail on the head. The ILS, which is the top row, is a precision approach. You are provided both a localizer and a glide slope, which means you are more precise, which means you can safely and with more reliability fly lower, knowing you're not going to hit anything. There's your GA. Localizer approach, you can see it says lock on the left column. That is a non-precision approach. In this case, you fly down to your MDA and you maintain that MDA until your missed approach point. It's less precise. You don't have a glide path or a glide slope in this case. So you have to add in a little extra altitude for padding, so it's 380 feet. Remember that these are both in MSL on the altimeter. Question is, what does the S mean? S-ILS and S-localizer means straight in.
That's the S over here. So we're looking at straight in approaches, and that is compared to the circling minima that are at the bottom here.
Right. Now, there's our MDA and visibility. You wouldn't really see any other prefix. MDA and visibility in this case, if you're category D, you're going 140 to 165 knots, which means at that point, you're not talking about RVR, you need whole visibility. So in this case, you need 600 feet and 2 miles, statute miles of visibility. And AGL altitude of an MDA, 432 feet, that's in the smaller fine print, or the smaller text rather.
And that altitude in this specific context is just advisory. So it's just telling you that at 480 feet on the altimeter, you would be 432 feet above the ground. One really helpful application of that is that we know that METARs are reported in the altitude above the ground. So if there's a cloud layer in the METAR or in the ATIS saying 500 feet, we know that that layer is 500 feet above the ground. Knowing that my circling minimum is 432 feet above the ground means there's a good chance that I'm going to be able to get down to the altitude at the MDA, and I should be able to see the runway, assuming that the visibility is okay. So that's really the key piece of information, and the value of that information here is it effectively does the math for you. All that is 480 feet minus the touchdown zone elevation. That being said, when we're flying other types of approaches, like a Category 2 approach, we may be using a minimum that is based on an AGL altitude. And so again, that piece of information can be helpful for you there.
All right, so now we're going to shift gears and talk about more interactive
Give you
stuff.
the chance. Give you the chance to figure out what the minimums are.
Yeah. So, first question. Straight-in ILS or runway 24 approach for a Category C aircraft. What are the minimums? 248. 248 what?
248 feet altitude.
Is that above the ground or above sea level?
Above sea level.
Okay, Elaine says above the ground. Suresh says above sea level. That's only part of, in either case, that's only part of the minimums. All right, good mix of responses here. Correct answer is
if it is above AGL, they usually put it in a bracket.
Not quite. So in this case, it's 248 feet of decision altitude. So that's 248 feet on the altimeter above sea level, which you can see the smaller text 200 that's not in parentheses. That 200 is, for reference, that's 200 feet decision height above the ground. So 248 feet above sea level, 200 feet above the ground, and they need 1,800 feet of RVR for this approach.
Remember, again, the minimums are not just an altitude, they also incorporate an RVR. For you in the private world, that's probably not going to be all that relevant, but certainly as an airline operator, that will be important.
Now, let's say we are a Category B aircraft flying the straight-in localizer runway 24 approach. While you figure out the minimums, Mark asked to say that again. Remember that minimums are not only an altitude. Minimums come in two parts. They are an altitude and a forward visibility. Having one of the two does not suffice. You need to have both the altitude and the visibility to continue and land.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a follow-up question on that, Alex. I'm curious to know your perspective on this. Of course, we know that we can't reliably determine what is an RVR, and we probably don't have a great way at 200 feet above the ground to be able to say, well, I know for sure I can see 2,000 feet down the runway. So I'm curious to know what your thought is on how you'd apply that RVR. If we're talking private here, so we're talking that's not going to be a limiting factor for the approach. You get to 248 feet, which is your minimum for the straight-in ILS runway 24. You see the runway, but how do you know that you actually have 1,800 feet RVR, or do you care?
I'd make a judgment call.
Yeah, I agree.
If I'm at minimums and I'm that low, I'm not going to spend time looking for runway markings or seeing how far, estimating how many stripes I see and doing the math of how far down the runway. I'm going to make a judgment call. Do I feel that it's safe to continue and land? Yeah, that's what I would do, and that's what I would teach.
Yep, and I would agree with that as well. Sorry to sidetrack you there.
No, that's a good question. Alrighty. Lost your presentation for a second, Evan. There we go.
Should be back now.
420 feet MSL on the altimeter. That is your MDA. That is also 372 feet above the ground as a reference. And your forward visibility is 2,400 feet of RER. Remember, this is an MDA, so it's higher and less precise. And lastly, ILS runway 24 approach with circling to runway 33 with an aircraft with a VREF of 70 knots. Joel asked about the 400 parentheses. We will cover that in just a second. For now, ILS runway 24 approach, ILS runway 24 approach, circling to runway 33 for an aircraft with a VREF of 70 knots. Question was, what is the 1 mile and 3.4 mile on the top of the table? That is actually a part of the plan view of figuring out the distance between what in this case are different fixes on the approach. That's not part of the minimums table.
So far, looking at the question of the circling to runway 33 with a VRF of 70 knots, we've got somebody saying 500 MSL, another 500 MSL and 100 RVR. We've got 480 MSL and 1 mile visibility.
Alrighty. And the correct answer is, let's determine what the category is first. VRF of 70 knots, that's category A. Because remember, 90 knots and below is category A. So, with category A aircraft, your minimums are 480 foot MSL MDA, which happens to be a... Sorry, say again?
Sorry, sir, continue.
So it's a 480 foot MSL MDA. It's a 432 foot AGL, but remember that's reference only. And you need 1 mile, it's actually, I believe it's a statute mile of visibility. Because I believe that all visibilities are given in statute miles.
I will double check on that for you as we go here.
But in either case, those are close enough. For ILS runway 24 approach, it's circling to runway 33. Remember, this is a circling approach now. 480 feet on the altimeter, 1 mile of forward visibility. And the next bullet point addresses, what do the numbers in parentheses beside the minimums represent? Does anybody know? Does anybody have the answer to this? Dan says military. Yeah, Dan is right. It's for military aircraft.
So for us in the civilian world, whether you're operating an airliner, whether you're operating a Cessna 172, we don't care about those. We can just ignore them. Important to know that they are not necessarily, or in fact, they are not the AGL altitude. They're just something we don't have to worry about.
All right. Any more questions on this slide? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to the approach segments. There are, generally speaking, 4 different types of approach segments. We have the initial approach. Then we have the intermediate part of the approach, which you actually transition onto the final approach course. Then you have the final approach, which is basically from the FAF, or the final approach fix, to the runway. And then if you don't land, you have the missed approach. We'll talk about all these. Navigating to final. We have a ton of ways to navigate from wherever we are onto final approach course. Let's be interactive. If you guys want to go ahead and list out in the chat a couple different, or just start listing ways of joining onto final approach course from wherever you may be. Just list them out.
By radar vectoring?
That's one.
Using stars and follow the RNAV path?
Yes, that's a little bit vague, but yes, that is one of them. A couple people are saying Parso, which is an IAF. It's 0678 of Concord, which is also a route. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, everybody's hitting the nail on the head here. So we do have vectors to final. That was one of them. We can have a feeder route, which is the Concord 067 radial to join Parso. That is one. You could do Parso itself, which is an initial approach fix. You could join from the Kettabunk VOR, which is also an initial approach fix, fly the 030 radial to Buxto. Or you could join Ad Buxto as the intermediate fix. Or, of course, vectors to final. Plenty of possibilities.
And we'll just show a couple of these here. So we've got the Kettabunk initial approach fix, a feeder route off of Concord and also off of Hycod. You've got another initial approach fix of Parso, an intermediate fix of Buxto, which would mostly be done via vectors, and as was mentioned, vectors to final.
Course reversals. So remember how last time we talked about holds? That's going to play a pretty big part here. You require course reversal when depicted unless You are either vectored to final, the chart says no PT, or air traffic control says you're cleared for a straight-in approach. If none of those three are met, you must fly a course reversal. But you may not fly them unless you are required to. So, procedure turn. You fly it as desired, normally as depicted. You have to remain on the protected side. Remember, here we do have the protected side mandate again. And normally you must remain within 10 miles of the final approach fix. That'll be written on the chart. So in this case, for example, let's say you're at the Nantucket VOR. You're directly over the field and you want to fly the approach. You track outbound on the 060 radial. At some point, you make a left turn to 015, give or take. Fly that for about a minute. Make a right or a left turn, whichever you choose, on a 195 heading to join the 240 radial back inbound. That's a procedure turn. Then you could have a hold in lieu of procedure turn. You fly this as a hold entry, like we talked about last time. You use the recommended hold entry based on the direction approaching the fix, like we talked about last time. And in this case, only the entry is required. Additional turns in the hold require authorization from air traffic control. And you'll notice that a hold in lieu of procedure turn is depicted on the chart, and a procedure turn is simply a barb that angles outward from the approach.
In some ways, the procedure turn looks like it's a little bit easier to interpret because it sort of gives you all the steps, you know exactly what headings to fly. The hold in lieu of procedure turn is a little bit more complicated because you have to use that trick and technique we talked about last time to actually determine the entry. That being said, you'll see hold in lieu of procedure turns probably much more commonly, especially on our nav approaches, because they just give you a lot more flexibility and functionality. You can enter the procedure at SAPI from almost any direction and safely make the course reversal happen. Whereas on the other version with the procedure turn, you're basically required to cross the fix and go back outbound. There's no easy way to do a straight-in approach, as you have that option from some directions anyway with the hold in lieu procedure turn.
Good point, Evan. Now let's talk about the components of an approach procedure, or an approach plate, as you'll hear them commonly referred to as by the FAA. So they contain the following elements. First, you have the pilot briefing information up at the top. That's all the huge chunk of text that you read about in brief with the other pilot. Then you have the notes section. Those talk about notes on the approach, such as like when you can't read the altimeter from the airport, what do you use, certain limitations on the approach, like if you can or can't use it at night, things like that.
And there's a lot of really important stuff that they like to bury in those notes. So you have to read through a lot of junk, like when the local altimeter setting is not received, use this one. And then on a lot of approaches, right in the middle, you'll find something important, like this approach is not available by use from the autopilot. Or as Alex said, you can't use this at night, or you can't land on this particular room at night. They have a tendency to bury those notes right in the middle of a long paragraph. So unfortunately, you have to read through a bunch of sort of more or less useless information. And you may often find out there's some pretty major airports, LaGuardia is one, where an autopilot coupled approach is not authorized below a certain altitude. So you have to be hand flying because of some issues with sensitivity and aircraft that could get in the way of the signal and basically throw the autopilot off.
Yeah, then you have the plan view, which is like a top-down bird's eye view of the approach itself. Then you have the missed approach holding pattern, which shows you how to fly the missed approach. Minimum safe altitude, with certain exceptions. This will be on most approaches. That's the altitude that provides you obstacle clearance within, in this case, 25 miles of Nantucket VOR. You have the profile view, which is like a side view that focuses on altitudes. Then you have our landing minimums, which we just discussed. And finally, an airport diagram. Any questions on this? Alrighty, seeing none, we'll move on. Missed approaches. A missed approach should be conducted whenever the runway environment or an identifiable part of the airport during a circling maneuver is not visible, and you are either below the MDA, you are at the MAP, or visual reference with the airport during a circling maneuver is lost. You should also initiate missed approaches if at any point on the instrument approach guidance is lost, such as a glitch in your GPS, or if full-scale deflection is reached on the instrument. Let's think about why. Let's say you're flying the localizer and you get distracted and you fly way off course, and suddenly your CDI shows full-scale deflection. Well, you don't know if you are maybe 0.1 mile off of the approach or if you are a whole 5 miles off the approach. It doesn't matter. You're full deflection. You have no idea where you are relative to the approach anymore, so you have to go missed.
There was an accident of a classic 737 in northern Canada several years ago that really focused a lot on crew resource management, but effectively, if they had followed this bullet point, people would have survived. The situation was exactly what Alec described, that there was full-scale deflection shown on the instrument. The co-pilot or the first officer was advocating for a go-round. The captain was saying, "Oh no, it's fine. Oh no, it's fine," and literally following no instrument, they crashed the airplane into mountainous terrain, well off of the course from the localizer and nowhere close to the glide slope, because of exactly this problem. The captain specifically, was busy trying to resolve this problem and trying to figure out what was wrong with this particular instrument. If they had just begun a missed approach, started to climb, the accident that happened never would have occurred.
Yeah, exactly. And then you also initiate the missed approach at a point as close as possible to the MAP for maximum terrain/obstacle clearance. But remember, initiate the missed approach whenever you feel the need to. So it doesn't mean, let's say you're unstable and you're off the approach and you want to missed approach and you want to execute missed or go missed, but you don't read this as, oh, I have to execute it at the MAP. No, if you're at any point on the approach and you feel the need to go missed, I would say go missed.
Yeah, start climbing, follow the actual guidance that you're on,
Yeah.
if you have it, up until you get to the missed approach point. But the biggest thing you can do, and we talk about this in the next slide as well, for initiating a missed approach during a circling maneuver, the biggest thing you can do is climb, because that's going to be taking you away from terrain and away from obstacles. So before you almost think about anything else, if you're starting to do a missed approach because of full-scale deflection on your guidance, or really for any other unstable reason, get the airplane pointing toward the sky.
Exactly, and that's where the MSA comes in, the minimum safe altitude we discussed on the previous slide. If things really start to go bad and you're losing kind of your bearings, you don't know where you are, you don't know where you're going, just climb to the MSA. You know that if you're within 25 miles of the airport, at or above your MSA, you're not going to hit anything.
Of course, you're going to want to let ATC know what's going on pretty quickly, because if you're not following the procedure or the missed approach, now there is a risk of traffic. So certainly there's no risk of obstacles above the MSA, but there could very well be another airplane there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, if a missed approach is initiated during a circling maneuver, what's step number one? You climb. Get the airplane nose up, get it flying up. Then you navigate as closely as possible to the center of the airport, so while you're circling, turn towards the airport, and then you fly the published missed for approach procedure for the cleared instrument approach. So let's say you're cleared on the ILS approach, and then you circle out of it, and then in the circle you decide to go missed, you fly the published missed approach procedure for the ILS approach. Now, questions for the audience. Is a missed approach the same thing as a go-around? Couple no's. Does anybody beg to differ and say yes? Looks like everybody's saying no, and I would tend to agree. A go-around is the physical act of transitioning from a descent to a climbing attitude. So, the 5 ups or the 5 C's, however your CFI taught you: power up, pitch up, gear up, flaps up, speak up, or cram it, climb it, clean it up, cool it, call it. That's the go-around is the act of transitioning from nose down to a nose up attitude and the associated flight path. A missed approach is what you do after, and that's actually flying the published missed approach procedure using navigational guidance. Second question. Should a missed approach be declared on a clear day during the recovery from an unstable approach? A couple people saying yes. Derek says a go-around should. More yeses. So the answer to this is, I would say yes. Remember, you were cleared for the approach. Unless air traffic control previously gave you different missed approach instructions than what's on the chart, if you are cleared for the approach, you are also cleared for flying the published missed approach in the event of a go-around. So oftentimes, if you say you're going around, air traffic control will assign you something like runway heading or 3000, but if they don't, you say you're going around and then you fly the missed approach until you're told to otherwise.
I fully agree with that. One of the reasons we added this slide is there's a lot of confusion in the sim world about the difference between a missed approach and a go-around. So we get people that effectively fly through the localizer. They have not captured the localizer, they didn't set up the airplane properly maybe, and now they're saying missed approach, thinking I missed the approach, I missed capturing the localizer. And of course, that's not what we're talking about. That's sort of a bit of a different scenario because they're going to have a heck of a time flying the published missed approach procedure if they're nowhere close to the airport to begin with. So we want to just make sure that language is clear. You know, if you've not been able to start the approach, you don't really technically miss the approach at that point. It's an issue of you just haven't captured the actual guidance. Similarly, if there's traffic on the runway, or if you decide that your approach is unstable, you could absolutely just say we're going around. And the advantage of that is now, as Alex says, ATC is more than likely just going to say, fly this heading, climb and maintain 3000. So you should be prepared to fly the missed approach, and certainly in the absence of any other instruction, that is what you would do because it is based on the clearance that you got for the approach. But if you don't like flying missed approaches as published, and most of us don't, because let's face it, who wants to hold when we don't have to, much easier to just say, we've had an unstable approach, we're going around, and at that point, as Alex said, 9 out of 10 times you're going to get a heading and an altitude. If you don't, or if you just get Roger, then of course flying the published missed approach is the right thing to do. And certainly any time that you're looking at any kind of a go-around maneuver because of weather, because of unstable approach, or anything else, your first thought should always be, what is the missed approach? And then if ATC comes back with something else, wonderful, they've just made your life a heck of a lot easier.
Yeah, good point, Evan. Any questions on this slide? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to our second to last slide tonight, actually. Special types of approach is called a contact approach. This is requested by a pilot when on an IFR flight plan, never assigned. It's requested. It is available when either traffic permits and air traffic control still provides traffic separation, and the reported ground visibility of the airport is at least 1 statute mile. For a contact approach, the pilot must remain clear of clouds and have at least 1 mile of flight visibility using a standard or special instrument approach procedure as a reference. So to put this more clearly, use an instrument approach reference, and then you can kind of navigate around clouds, assuming you still see the runway to go ahead and land.
I think of a contact approach almost as a combination visual and instrument approach in some ways. So where you might use it is, and this is actually covered in Wings IFR 22, it looks at Bar Harbor, which is a coastal airport. Lots of times you can see banks of fog come in. And like many small airports, it only has an instrument approach and ILS to one side, to runway 22. There's no ILS approach to runway 4. So you might be coming into the Bar Harbor area from the southwest, say from Boston, and you can see runway 4. You can see half the airport, but the other half of the airport has fog over it. And the reported visibility might be 2 miles, but you can see there's a fog bank right off the end of runway 22. And so flying the ILS into a fog bank and a likely missed approach doesn't look like a great option for you. But of course, you can't necessarily cancel IFR in the conditions that are reported, or perhaps you don't want to cancel IFR for any number of other reasons. This is where a contact approach can be very helpful. So by requesting and getting approval for a contact approach, you can effectively now navigate visually, land on runway 4, assuming everything works out. But if you don't, you have the benefit of being able to legally fly the published missed approach procedure while ATC is still giving you traffic separation. So effectively, when you get approval for a contact approach, the entire airport becomes yours. It's protected from the perspective of traffic, and you don't need to fly an ILS. You can navigate however you want to land on a runway that works. There's absolutely some safety considerations associated with that. You know, do you really want to be flying into an airport where the ILS conditions aren't great? Maybe, maybe not. I've flown them. they're tremendously helpful for the situation I described, and I've landed at airports perfectly safely and totally visually that I don't think I would have been able to get into had I flown the ILS straight into a fog bank and then subsequently flown the missed approach. But they're certainly a very unique type of approach. We don't see them too often on the network, and it's an interesting concept that comes up from time to time.
Yeah, I've for what it's worth, I've flown a contact approach in my career only once, but it was tremendously useful for exactly the same situation Evan described. Maybe the part of the instrument approach is obscured and you can't actually fly it, you wouldn't be able to get in, but the other half of the airport is clear as day. Big thing on Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and the surrounding islands. Or you could have a visual approach. You initiate this by a pilot or air traffic control, and once the pilot reports the aircraft or the preceding airport or the preceding traffic in sight, air traffic control can clear them for a visual approach, and you must be VFR at the airport, meaning 1,000 feet of ceiling and 3 or better miles of visibility. Any questions on this? Okay. For further info, we covered just the tip of the iceberg tonight on instrument approach procedures, and there's more next week. If you have any further questions, I would encourage you to check out the links both on the PowerPoint and what Evan just posted in the chat, same links. They are the Instrument Flying Handbook and also the Instrument Procedures Handbook. The Instrument Flying Handbook talks about how you would fly an approach practically. Instrument Procedures Handbook talks about the more technical aspects of the instrument procedures themselves. With that in mind, thank you very much for for listening to tonight's Approach Plates #1 curriculum. Next week, we will delve into flying instrument approaches under air traffic control. If you have any questions, I encourage you to reach out either to me, to Evan, or to your local flight instructor.
And if you do have any questions, we can stick around for a couple minutes to answer those once the recording is concluded. I will say as well, for those who were here last week, or if you want some more information on holds, Alec and I spent about an hour and a half doing a recording specifically for you to watch online that goes through holds. We've added in a couple of new resources, including a little link that allows you to visualize the heading indicator wherever you are, and to be able to go through those holding examples we covered together at your own pace. So if you're interested in a review of that session, when you look at the ground school series on YouTube, that is the one that you'll see as opposed to the live recording. We've also uploaded the live recording in the notes of that episode in case you wanted to see it. Any questions for us, feel free to hang on to those for just a moment until the recording is done. And otherwise, we'll look forward to seeing everybody next week for the second half of Approach Plates.